Welcome once again to the Museum of the African American Experience. Today, I want to talk to you about one of the most important figures from African American civil rights history. Today, I want to talk to you about Fannie Lou Hamer. Mrs. Hamer was born October 6, 1917, in Montgomery County, Mississippi. She was a granddaughter of slaves. Her family lived and worked as sharecroppers on a cotton plantation in Ruleville, Mississippi from the time she was 2 years old. I should define sharecropping. Every society, every modern society that abolished slavery came up with a way to maintain the system just a little bit longer. In the Caribbean, the planters came up with something called apprenticeship, where we were no longer the property of the plantation, but we, the former slaves, were first forced to work there as a kind of indentured servant for a specified period. Salary was determined by the plantation owners, and there was no negotiating. We also had to rent land in something called tenantries. We became tenants, and we had to pay rent for the shack that we used to occupy as slaves. There was no pretense of owning anything. You worked for your former owner, and you paid the rent that they charged because you were legally bound to that plantation. With the exception of the Maroons in Jamaica, Cuba, Saint Domingue, and a couple of other Caribbean islands and Central American countries, entire black populations were legally re-enslaved by apprenticeship laws. In the southern United States, the practice was called sharecropping, essentially the same, except that you were not legally bound to the land. You worked it for yourself, but you had to buy your seed, fertilizer, and all your supplies from the plantation owner, and then pay them half of your earnings after you did all the work to raise, harvest, and sell the crops. Sharecroppers had very large families. It took a lot of hands to work a cotton field. Little Fanny was the youngest of 20 children. She started helping in the cotton fields at age 6, and by the time she was 12 years old, she was a full-time worker. She had to leave school, but she had a very sharp mind and continued to learn. She was hired as a timekeeper on the plantation because she knew how to read and write. In 1962, some workers from SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, pronounced SNCC, held a meeting at her church. And for the first time, Fannie Lou Hamer heard black people talking about voting and voting rights and civil rights. And this was something new. She'd never heard anyone talking like this before, but she was enchanted by it. She knew that was something she wanted to do. So the very next day, she went down to the county seat and tried to register to vote. Um, Fanny was not prepared for the system. She failed the test the first time. Only black people were forced to take the poll test, and the truth is, almost nobody could pass it without some work, without studying for it. Fanny studied, and she passed it the second time. That was December 1962. She received the results in 1963. And right away she went to work. She started working for SNCC. She became a field coordinator for SNCC. She traveled all over the South teaching people how to prepare for those poll tests and how to pass the voter registration. She was paid she was paid a salary of $10 a week. And Fanny says that she was paid the money when SNCC had $10. But a lot of times Snake didn't have the $10, so life was hard for her. She encountered a lot of hardship in her work. On June 9th, 1963, Mrs. Hamer and some of her workers were severely beaten by Mississippi police, but that didn't even slow her down. She just kept working. She helped organize the 1964 Freedom Summer in Mississippi. This event was sponsored by SNCC, the SCLC, that's the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, CORE, that's the Congress on Racial Equality, and the NAACP. She also organized the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. After she was not allowed to participate in the local precinct meeting, she went out and formed her own Democratic Party, the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, and she took her party to the National Democratic Convention in Atlantic City that year, 1964, to challenge the legal right of the Mississippi delegation to represent the state of Mississippi. On July 22nd, Mrs. Hamer made a speech to the Credentials Committee. This was televised, it was recorded for television, it was televised live, except that President Lyndon Johnson decided in the middle of her speech that he had to hold an emergency press conference. Of course, she was preempted, but the TV stations, the radio stations did play her full speech later on. There was just chaos. There was nothing but war at that 1964 convention. It was almost as bad as 1968. Finally, the National Party offered the MFDP two at-large seats. These seats had no voting rights, no power to vote on anything. And the party even stipulated which two members would get the seats. Of course, Mrs. Hamer turned those seats down. As a direct result of the chaos of 1964 and a few other things that happened in between, Congress was forced to pass the 1964 Voting Rights Act, which specifically prohibited literacy tests and mandated federal supervision for any changes to voting laws in the states that were known for racist manipulation of the voting system. Here is Mrs. Hamer with two other icons of the 1964 movement, Victoria Jackson Gray and Annie Devine. The lady in the middle, Victoria, she ran for Senate, and Mrs. Hamer and Mrs. Devine, they ran for the House, trying to create some changes in Mississippi. Here's some text from her speech to the convention. This was in Atlantic City, 1964. Mrs. Hamer continued to work. For the rest of her life, she worked for people, not just black people. She worked for people. She helped to found a lot of organizations that did a lot of good. She's buried in Ruleville, Tennessee, Ruleville, Mississippi, and her headstone reads, "I am sick and tired of being sick and tired." Her famous quote from Fannie Lou Hamer, my hero of the day. Fannie Lou Hamer, born 1917 in Mississippi, a tireless worker. Thank you for all you did. This is Winn Wellman reporting from the Museum of the African American Experience. Stay tuned.